The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the drawing room of Bentley House. Miss Charlotte Bentley sat by the window with an unopened book in her lap, her amber eyes fixed on the winding road that led to Stratton Hall. 7 years had passed. 7 years of waiting, of hoping, and of refusing perfectly respectable proposals because none of the gentlemen who asked were him. Charlotte was 23 now, no longer the gangly child who had raced through the gardens of Stratton Hall with the Earl's golden-haired son. Her chestnut hair was properly dressed, her figure had acquired the curves of womanhood, and her mind had been sharpened by years of voracious reading. Yet in her heart, she remained that 8-year-old girl who had fallen hopelessly in love with a boy who treated her as an equal. He had listened to her opinions as though they mattered, and he had made her believe that the daughter of a textile merchant could be worthy of notice. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel made her heart leap. She rose without thinking, pressing close to the window pane. There it was. The Stratton traveling coach, dusty from the journey, bore the family crest on its gleaming black door. He had returned. If you are moved by stories of love that spans years and defies social barriers, please subscribe now and join us on this journey. You will not want to miss what happens next. Charlotte's mother, Mrs. Eleanor Bentley, appeared in the doorway with a particular expression that meant unwelcome news was forthcoming. She was a handsome woman of 45, possessed of the practical nature that came from being born into trade and married into modest prosperity. "Charlotte, dearest, you must compose yourself," her mother said gently. "The servants will notice if you continue to watch that road as though your very life depends upon it." "I am perfectly composed, Mamma," Charlotte replied, though her trembling hands betrayed her. "The Earl has sent word that they will receive callers the day after tomorrow," Mrs. Bentley continued, settling into her favorite chair. "It would be appropriate for us to pay our respects. Your father has business matters to discuss regarding the wool contracts." Charlotte nodded, not trusting her voice. 2 days. In 2 days, she would see Henry Stratton again, after 7 endless years of separation. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay in her bed, staring at the canopy above, remembering. She saw Henry at 16, standing in the Stratton library, telling her he was leaving for Oxford. She recalled the awkward embrace they had shared, his promise to write, and the way his voice had cracked when he said goodbye. He had written, faithfully, for the first year. Long letters arrived full of details about his studies, his new friends, and the strange customs of university life. Then the letters grew shorter and less frequent. By the 2nd year, they stopped entirely. Charlotte had continued to write for another 6 months, pouring her heart onto paper that went unanswered. Eventually, wounded pride forced her to stop. But she never stopped loving him. She never stopped hoping that one day he would return and remember the girl who had been his closest companion. The morning of the visit dawned gray and drizzly, typical of Devonshire in springtime. Charlotte changed her dress 3 times before settling on a modest gown of lilac muslin that her mother assured her was both flattering and appropriate. The Bentley carriage made the short journey to Stratton Hall, and with each turn of the wheels, Charlotte's heart beat faster. Stratton Hall rose before them like something from a dream. It was a magnificent Palladian mansion of honey-colored stone that spoke of old money and ancient privilege. The home she had played in as a child now seemed impossibly grand. It stood as a monument to the vast social chasm that separated her family from the Earls. The butler, Stevens, whom Charlotte remembered as a young footman, greeted them with appropriate formality. He led them to the drawing room where the Earl and his son were receiving visitors. Charlotte's father, Mr. Thomas Bentley, led the way with her mother close behind. Charlotte followed, her palms damp inside her gloves, her breath coming short. The Earl of Stratton stood by the fireplace, a tall man of 60 with iron-gray hair and the bearing of one born to command. Beside him stood a younger man, and Charlotte's world tilted on its axis. Henry Stratton, Viscount Stratton, was even more handsome than her memories had painted him. His hair remained the color of ripe wheat, his eyes the clear blue of a summer sky, but his face had lost its boyish softness. He was a man now, elegant in his morning coat, every inch the aristocratic air. Their eyes met across the room. Charlotte waited for recognition to dawn, for that smile she remembered so well to light his features. Instead, Lord Stratton offered her the same polite, distant nod he had given her parents. His gaze moved past her to greet the next visitors entering behind them. He did not know her. 7 years of loving, of waiting, and of refusing other men had passed, and Henry Stratton did not even recognize her. Charlotte felt something inside her chest crack, a hairline fracture in the careful shell she had built around her heart. She managed to curtsy when her mother introduced her. She managed to murmur the appropriate pleasantries, but she could not meet his eyes again. The pain was too acute and too raw. They were invited to take tea, and Charlotte found herself seated on a delicate chair near the window. She accepted a cup with hands that shook imperceptibly. Her father and the Earl were deep in discussion about wool prices and shipping routes. Her mother chatted with Lady Stratton's sister, who served as the household's hostess since the Countess had passed away 5 years prior. Henry stood by the fireplace, looking bored and distant, as though he would rather be anywhere else. Charlotte set down her teacup to remove her gloves, as the room had grown warm. The small sapphire ring on her right hand caught the light. It was the ring that Henry's grandmother had given her when she was 16, saying every young lady deserved at least one piece of fine jewelry. Charlotte had worn it every day since, a talisman against disappointment. "Charlotte? Little Charlotte Bentley?" The voice was sharp with shock. Charlotte looked up to find Henry staring at her hand, then at her face, his expression transformed. Color drained from his features as recognition crashed over him like a wave. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, abandoning all protocol, and dropped into the chair beside her. "Good God, Charlotte, I did not. I could not. How did you? When did you?" He seemed unable to form a complete sentence. His elegant composure shattered. "You have changed so entirely. I mean, not that you were not lovely before, but I expected, that is, I thought." 7 years changes people, my lord," Charlotte said quietly, proud that her voice remained steady. "I am no longer the child who followed you about the gardens." "Henry," he corrected immediately. "You must call me Henry, as you always did. Please, I insist." He was looking at her now as though truly seeing her for the first time, his eyes moving over her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Tell me everything. What have you been reading? Are you still passionate about poetry? Do you still ride that dreadful mare your father purchased from the tinker?" "Dulcinea died 2 years ago," Charlotte replied. "And yes, I still read poetry, though I have broadened my interests to include political philosophy and economics, which I am certain you will find terribly inappropriate for a lady." "I find it fascinating," Henry said, and the warmth in his voice reminded her painfully of the boy she had loved. "You always had the most interesting mind of anyone I knew. I should very much like to hear your thoughts on the current situation with the manufacturing districts." For the next hour, they talked as they had not talked in 7 years. Henry asked question after question, seeming genuinely interested in her answers. He occasionally laughed at her wry observations about country society. The Earl watched with obvious disapproval. His mouth tightened each time his heir leaned closer to the merchant's daughter, but Henry appeared not to notice. Charlotte found herself relaxing, despite her earlier hurt, falling back into the easy rhythm of conversation they had shared as children. She told him about the book she had been reading, a scandalous novel by an anonymous lady that had caused quite a stir in London. Henry admitted he had read the same book and found it rather tame compared to some of the Gothic romances his mother had kept hidden in her private library. "Do you still write poetry?" Henry asked suddenly. "You used to compose the most marvelous verses about the countryside. I kept every letter you sent me at Oxford with your little poems tucked inside." Charlotte felt heat rise to her cheeks. "You kept them?" I thought when you stopped writing that you had forgotten all about me and my silly verses." "Never forgotten," Henry said quietly, his blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Never for a single moment, Charlotte. I stopped writing because I became someone I did not wish you to know. Someone who would have disappointed the girl who wrote those beautiful, innocent poems." There was such pain in his voice that Charlotte wanted to reach out and take his hand to offer comfort. But they were in a room full of people, and such a gesture would be noted and remarked upon. Instead, she said softly, "We all change as we grow, Henry. The question is whether we change into people we can respect or people we must learn to forgive." "What if forgiveness is impossible?" he asked. "What if the things one has done are too dark and too shameful?" "Then one must learn to live with shadows," Charlotte replied. "But shadows are easier to bear when someone stands beside you willing to share the darkness." The Earl's voice cut through their conversation. "Stratton, Lord Waverley has arrived and wishes to discuss the timber contracts. You must attend to business." Henry rose reluctantly, his eyes never leaving Charlotte's face. "Tomorrow," he said. "Please say I may call tomorrow." "Tomorrow," Charlotte agreed, and watched him walk away with a mixture of hope and trepidation. When the Bentleys finally took their leave, Henry followed them to the door, ignoring propriety entirely. "May I call upon you tomorrow, Charlotte?" he asked quietly, so the others would not hear. "I should very much like to continue our conversation. There is so much I wish to tell you, so much I need to explain." Charlotte's treacherous heart soared. "If you wish, my lord." "Henry," he corrected again, his smile reaching his eyes. "Always, Henry, to you." That night, Charlotte allowed herself to hope. Perhaps the years apart had been necessary. Perhaps Henry had needed to become the man he was meant to be before he could see her as the woman she had become. Perhaps, despite all the obstacles of class and circumstance, there was a chance for them. She sat at her writing desk and pulled out the old letters Henry had sent from Oxford, reading them by candlelight. The first letters were full of enthusiasm, describing his rooms, his tutors, and the strange customs of undergraduate life. "I miss our conversations, Charlotte," he had written. "The other fellows here speak only of hunting and cards. None of them have read Milton or care a fig for poetry. I find myself thinking often of our afternoons in the library at the Hall, arguing about whether Shakespeare truly wrote all the plays attributed to him. Do you remember how adamant you were that the Earl of Oxford must have been the true author? I have found no one here who can match your passion for literature." The later letters were shorter and more strained. "Oxford is not what I expected," one read. "Or perhaps I am not what I expected to be. I find myself drawn into pursuits that would shock you, Charlotte. It is easier to be like everyone else than to remain apart. Forgive me for the brevity of this letter. I find I have little to say that would be fit for your eyes." The last letter she had received was barely a page. "Dear Charlotte, I am leaving for the continent with several friends. The grand tour awaits. I do not know when I shall return to England. Please do not wait for letters that I may not be able to send. Live your life, Charlotte, and be happy. That is all I wish for you. Your devoted friend, Henry." She had cried for 3 days after receiving that letter, recognizing it for what it was: a goodbye, a severing of the connection between them. She had written back twice more, letters that had gone unanswered, before finally accepting that the boy she loved had become a man who no longer needed her friendship. She was a fool. She understood that 3 days later when Henry arrived at Bentley House for the first of what would become daily visits. He was charming, attentive, and interested in her opinions, but there were shadows in his eyes that had not been there in his youth. When she asked about his time in London, his face shuttered closed. When she mentioned mutual acquaintances who had written about seeing him at various entertainments, he changed the subject with practiced ease. True to his word, Henry appeared at Bentley House the following morning, riding the magnificent bay gelding that had caught Charlotte's attention the previous day. Her mother received him in the drawing room with proper formality, though Charlotte noted the slight smile that played about her lips. Mrs. Bentley was no fool. She had seen the way her daughter's face had glowed when speaking of Henry's visit, and she had her own hopes for what might develop. "Miss Bentley," Henry said, bowing over Charlotte's hand with a formality that seemed at odds with the intimacy of their conversation the previous day. "I wondered if you might care to ride out this morning. The weather has improved considerably, and I recall you were always fond of the bridle path that runs along the river." Charlotte glanced at her mother, who nodded permission. "That would be delightful, my lord. Allow me a moment to change into my riding habit." 20 minutes later, Charlotte emerged in a deep blue riding habit that her mother had commissioned from a London modiste the previous year. It was perhaps more fashionable than strictly necessary for country riding, but Charlotte could not help wanting to look her best. Henry's eyes widened appreciably when he saw her, and she felt a flush of pleasure at his obvious admiration. They rode out with Charlotte's groom following at the prescribed distance, close enough to observe propriety, but far enough to allow private conversation. For the first quarter hour, they spoke of inconsequential things. They discussed the weather, the state of the roads, and the health of various neighbors. But gradually, as they followed the winding path beside the river, their conversation deepened. "You asked yesterday what I have been doing these 7 years, Charlotte said, guiding her mare around a puddle left by the previous day's rain. "But you have told me nothing of your own experiences. What was the grand tour like? Did you see all the wonders you wrote about hoping to visit?" Henry was silent for so long that Charlotte thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and troubled. "The grand tour was everything and nothing that I expected. Italy was beautiful, Rome magnificent, Paris glittering and sophisticated, but I found no joy in any of it. I traveled with a group of young men whose primary interests were gambling, drinking, and pursuing women of questionable virtue. I told myself I was simply seeing the world, experiencing life, and becoming a man. But in truth, I was running away." "From what?" Charlotte asked gently. "From responsibility, from expectation, from the knowledge that my entire life had been planned out before I was even born." He turned to look at her, and the pain in his eyes made Charlotte's heart ache. "Do you know what it is like to be always told what you must do, who you must be, and how you must conduct yourself? Every action is scrutinized, and every choice is measured against the standard of what is appropriate for the heir to an earldom." "No," Charlotte admitted, "but I know what it is like to be told that you can never be enough, that your birth, your family, and your very existence places you forever beneath those born to privilege. That no matter how educated you become, how accomplished, or how worthy, society will always see you as the merchant's daughter who should know her place." Henry reined in his horse, forcing Charlotte to stop as well. The groom, sensing the need for privacy, fell back a few more paces. "Is that what you think?" Henry asked. "That I see you as beneath me?" "I think society sees me that way," Charlotte replied carefully. "And you are part of society, Henry, whether you wish to be or not. Your father certainly made his feelings clear yesterday. Every time you spoke to me, he looked as though he had tasted something sour." "My father is a pompous man who values lineage above character," Henry said with unexpected vehemence. "He married my mother for her bloodlines and spent 30 years making her miserable because she could never quite live up to his impossible standards. I watched her fade away, year by year, until she was a shadow of the vibrant woman she had been in her youth. I will not make the same mistake." "What mistake is that?" Charlotte asked, though her heart was beating so hard she was certain Henry must hear it. "Allowing pride and propriety to dictate matters of the heart," Henry said. He urged his horse forward again, and they continued riding in silence for several minutes. They reached a spot where the river widened into a pool. Willow trees trailed their branches in the water, and Henry suggested they stop to rest the horses. The groom dismounted and busied himself checking the animals' hooves, giving them as much privacy as was possible under the circumstances. Charlotte and Henry walked to the water's edge. Charlotte was transported back to another day and another time when they had been children playing at this very spot. Henry had been teaching her to skip stones, his hand over hers, showing her the proper angle for release. She had been 12, he 14, and she had thought her heart would burst with happiness at his closeness. "Do you remember?" Henry asked softly, as though reading her thoughts. "You made me promise that day that we would always be friends, no matter what happened. I have broken nearly every promise I have ever made, Charlotte, but not that one, not in my heart." "Actions speak louder than promises," Charlotte said, unable to keep a note of bitterness from her voice. "You stopped writing. You disappeared for years. You came back and did not even recognize me." "I stopped writing because I was ashamed," Henry burst out. "Because I had become exactly the kind of useless aristocrat I swore I would never be. Because I could not bear for you to know what I had become. And I did not recognize you because I was looking for a child, Charlotte, and you are so very much a woman who would be entirely justified in despising me for my weakness and cowardice." Charlotte turned to face him fully, searching his face for truth. "I could never despise you, Henry. I have spent 7 years trying and failing to stop loving you. Do you think I refused 3 perfectly respectable proposals because I am overly particular? I refused them because none of them were you." The words hung in the air between them, bold and irrevocable. Charlotte felt her cheeks flame with embarrassment at her own audacity. Ladies did not speak so plainly. They did not confess their feelings with such naked honesty. But she was tired of pretending. She was tired of hiding behind propriety and polite evasions. Henry closed the distance between them in 2 strides, grasping her hands in his. "Charlotte, there are things you do not know, and circumstances that complicate everything. I cannot, that is, I am not free to. There are obligations I must." He stopped, frustrated by his own inability to articulate what he needed to say. "Then tell me," Charlotte said simply. "Whatever it is, Henry, tell me the truth. I am no longer a child to be protected from unpleasant realities. I am a woman grown, capable of understanding complicated situations." But before Henry could respond, the groom called out a warning. Another rider was approaching along the path. As propriety demanded, Henry and Charlotte stepped apart, putting a respectable distance between them. The moment was lost, and with it, whatever confession Henry had been about to make. The days that followed established a pattern. Henry would arrive at Bentley House each morning. They would ride or walk together, always chaperoned and always proper, but with an intimacy that grew with each passing day. They talked about everything and nothing. They discussed books and politics, music and philosophy, dreams and fears. Charlotte found herself sharing thoughts she had never voiced to another soul, and Henry seemed equally willing to be vulnerable with her. But there were still shadows in his eyes, and still moments when he seemed on the verge of confession before pulling back. There were also absences. Times when he was called away suddenly to attend to estate business or family matters, returning hours later with a tension in his shoulders that spoke of burdens Charlotte could not see. They talked about poetry, and Henry admitted he had written some wretched verses himself during his time abroad. They were attempts to capture in words the emptiness he felt. Charlotte asked to see them, but he refused, saying they were too raw and too revealing. They discussed the political situation and the unrest in the manufacturing districts. Charlotte was surprised by the depth of Henry's knowledge and the progressive nature of his views. He believed in reform, in improving conditions for workers, and in using his position to advocate for those who had no voice. "You sound like a radical," Charlotte teased one afternoon as they walked through the gardens at Bentley House. "Perhaps I am," Henry replied. "Or perhaps I simply believe that privilege comes with responsibility. I have seen enough of poverty and suffering, both in England and abroad, to know that the current system is unsustainable. Change is coming, Charlotte, whether the aristocracy wishes it or not. The only question is whether we will be part of that change or swept away by it. Charlotte was impressed by his passion and his willingness to challenge the very system that had given him every advantage. This was not the aimless young man she had feared he had become. This was someone with conviction and with purpose, even if that purpose was clouded by whatever secret burden he carried. 3 weeks passed in this manner, and Charlotte was happier than she had been in years. But happiness, she was about to discover, was a fragile thing in the unforgiving world of the ton. Devonshire society, small and insular, began to whisper. Mrs. Regina Ashby, the self-appointed arbiter of local morality, made her feelings known at a card party that Charlotte attended with her mother. "How charming," Mrs. Ashby announced in a voice that carried across the room, "to see young ladies who forget their proper station in life. One would think that certain persons might have learned by now that reaching above oneself only leads to disappointment and disgrace." The words were followed by significant looks in Charlotte's direction. Charlotte felt heat flood her cheeks, but she kept her eyes on her cards. She refused to give Mrs. Ashby the satisfaction of seeing her hurt. "Ambition is one thing," another lady added with false sympathy. It was the pinch-faced Miss Agatha Norwood who had been hoping to catch Henry's eye herself. But when a girl begins to imagine herself worthy of attentions from gentlemen so far above her sphere, well, it can only end in heartbreak and ruin. We have all seen how these situations progress. The gentleman amuses himself for a season, then returns to his own kind, leaving the unfortunate girl to face the consequences of her presumption. Mrs. Ashby nodded sagely. Precisely so. And the pity of it is that such girls often refuse perfectly acceptable matches from men of their own station, holding out for something that can never be. One can only hope that Miss Bentley will come to her senses before she finds herself entirely unmarriageable. Charlotte's mother placed a restraining hand on her daughter's arm, sensing Charlotte's rising anger. But Charlotte had endured enough. She set down her cards with careful precision and rose from the table. "How fascinating," Charlotte said in a voice of ice, "to hear such concern for my welfare from ladies who have never shown me a moment's genuine kindness. I wonder, Mrs. Ashby, whether your anxiety stems from true compassion or from envy that the gentleman in question finds my company more pleasant than that of certain other young ladies who have been throwing themselves at his head for years without success." The room fell silent. Miss Norwood's face turned an ugly shade of red. Mrs. Ashby drew herself up with affronted dignity. "How dare you speak to me in such a manner? Your mother clearly has not taught you proper respect for your betters." "My mother has taught me to respect those who demonstrate character and kindness," Charlotte replied. "As for betters, I find that worth is measured by deeds rather than birth. Good evening, ladies. I find I have no appetite for cards tonight." She swept from the room with her head high. Her mother followed after making hurried apologies. In the carriage, Charlotte finally allowed her composure to crack. She pressed her hands to her burning cheeks and fought back tears of humiliation and rage. "Pay them no mind, dearest," Mrs. Bentley said gently. "Jealous women have always been unkind to those they perceive as threats." "But they are right, Mamma," Charlotte whispered. "I am reaching above my station. Henry is the heir to an earldom, and I am merely the daughter of a man who made his fortune in trade. What future could there possibly be for us? Even if Henry wishes it, his father would never permit such a match. I am setting myself up for heartbreak, and everyone can see it but me." "The future you make for yourselves, if you are both brave enough," her mother replied. "Your father's parents said the same to him when he chose to marry me. We have been happy these 25 years despite their predictions of doom. Love, true love, finds a way if the hearts involved are steadfast." But Charlotte's confidence had been shaken. When Henry arrived the next morning, suggesting another ride, she made excuses. When he called the day after, she claimed to be unwell. On the third day, He appeared at the door with such obvious concern that her mother admitted him despite Charlotte's protests. "What is wrong?" Henry demanded without preamble, finding Charlotte in the small parlor where she had been pretending to embroider. "Have I offended you in some way? Please, Charlotte, tell me what troubles you." "Nothing troubles me, my lord," she said, not looking up from her hopeless stitching. She had managed to create a tangled mess of threads that bore no resemblance to the rose pattern she was attempting. "I simply think it best if we do not continue our acquaintance so publicly. People are beginning to talk, and it is not fair to your position or my reputation." "People are always talking," Henry said dismissively. "That is what people do when they have nothing better to occupy their small minds. Charlotte, surely you must know, and surely you understand that I—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with himself. "There are things I must tell you, and circumstances that complicate matters, but my feelings are not in question. You must believe that." Charlotte did look up then, searching his face for truth. "What circumstances, Henry? What is it you are not telling me? For weeks now you have hinted at some obstacle or some complication, but you will not speak plainly. How can I trust you when you keep secrets from me?" Henry knelt beside her chair, taking her hand despite the impropriety of the gesture. "I want to tell you everything. I will tell you everything, I swear it. But I need time to set certain matters in order first. There are people whose lives would be destroyed if I acted rashly. Charlotte, I am asking you to trust me just a little longer. Can you do that?" Before Charlotte could answer, they were interrupted by the butler announcing another visitor. Mr. Richard Whitfield, the local vicar, was a pleasant-faced man of 28 who had been paying Charlotte marked attention for the past year. Henry's expression closed like a door slamming shut. He rose, dropped Charlotte's hand, and stepped back to a proper distance. "I should take my leave," he said stiffly. "Good day, Miss Bentley. Good day, Mr. Whitfield." Charlotte wanted to call him back to demand the explanation he had been about to give, but propriety held her tongue. She endured an awkward hour with Mr. Whitfield, who seemed determined to make his intentions clear despite her lack of encouragement. Mr. Whitfield was everything a sensible woman should want in a husband. He was kind, steady, and comfortably situated with his vicarage and modest income. He would never cause scandal, never break her heart, and never expose her to the cruelty of those who believed themselves her betters. He represented safety, security, and respectability. "Miss Bentley," he said as he prepared to take his leave, "I hope you will not think me presumptuous, but I feel I must speak plainly. I have admired you for some time now, and I believe we could build a very comfortable life together. I can offer you a respectable position in society, a comfortable home, and a husband who would never expose you to the censure and cruelty of those who believe themselves your betters. Sometimes the safe choice is the wisest choice. Will you at least consider allowing me to speak to your father about my intentions?" Charlotte felt trapped. Mr. Whitfield was offering her exactly what Mrs. Ashby and the other gossips thought she should want. It was a safe and appropriate match with a man of her own station. There was no scandal, no heartbreak, and no reaching above herself. And yet the thought of accepting him made her feel as though she were suffocating. That is, Mr. Whitfield, I am honored by your regard," Charlotte said carefully. "But I cannot encourage you at this time. My affections are, that is, I am not prepared to consider any gentleman's suit at present." Mr. Whitfield's face fell, but he rallied with a sad smile. "I understand, but if circumstances change, or if you find that the gentleman you currently favor is not able to offer you what you deserve, I hope you will remember that my regard is constant. I will wait, Miss Bentley, for as long as you need." When he finally departed, Charlotte felt exhausted. She wanted to ride to Stratton Hall to demand that Henry tell her the truth about whatever was preventing him from speaking freely. But pride held her back. If Henry truly cared for her, he would find a way to overcome whatever obstacles stood in their path. If he did not, then it was better to discover it now than to continue hoping for something that could never be. She was still considering his words 3 days later when an elegant traveling coach arrived at Stratton Hall, bringing a visitor who would change everything. Charlotte first glimpsed the woman at the village market, where she had gone with her mother to select fabrics. The stranger was impossible to miss. Her beauty was so striking that conversation stopped as she passed. She was perhaps 30 years old, with hair the color of midnight, skin like porcelain, and eyes the vivid green of emeralds. Her gown was the latest London fashion, cut daringly low and fashioned from silk that moved with an indiscreet elegance. "Who is that?" Charlotte asked Mrs. Davies, the draper's wife, who knew every piece of gossip in 3 counties. "That, my dear, is Mrs. Isabel Fairmont," Mrs. Davies replied, with the particular relish of one sharing scandalous information. "A widow, she claims, though there are those who say her husband was nothing more than a convenient fiction. She arrived yesterday at Stratton Hall, invited by the Earl himself, though why he would invite such a creature is beyond comprehension." Charlotte felt ice form in her stomach. "Does anyone know her connection to the family?" "Oh, my dear innocent child," Mrs. Davies said, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "She was Lord Stratton's particular friend in London, if you take my meaning. They say she kept apartments in Covent Garden, and that his lordship was her most devoted patron. The whole of London society knew of their arrangement. Some say she was the reason he delayed returning to Devonshire for so long. She held such a hold over him." The market seemed to tilt around Charlotte. Henry's particular friend. The phrase was an euphemism everyone understood. Mrs. Fairmont had been Henry's mistress, and perhaps she still was. He had brought her here to Devonshire, while he had been paying Charlotte such marked attention. That evening, Charlotte claimed illness and took to her bed, but sleep would not come. Instead, she lay in the darkness. Memories played in her mind with cruel clarity. She recalled Henry's evasions when she asked about London. She saw the shadows in his eyes. She remembered the way he had begun to confess something before Mr. Whitfield interrupted. Had he been trying to warn her about his mistress? Or had he simply been enjoying her naive devotion while maintaining his sophisticated relationship with the beautiful widow? She thought of the hour they had spent by the river, his hands holding hers and his eyes full of something she had believed was love. Had it all been a lie? Or was this another of those complicated circumstances he kept mentioning but never explaining? Charlotte wanted desperately to believe the latter, but the evidence seemed damning. 3 days passed in which Charlotte remained at home. She refused all visitors, including Henry, who called twice each day only to be turned away. On the 4th day, her mother insisted she must go to the village to deliver preserves to old Mrs. Fletcher, who had been ailing. Charlotte agreed, thinking the errand would at least occupy her mind and prevent her from dwelling on Henry and his beautiful mistress. She had just emerged from Mrs. Fletcher's cottage, basket in hand, when she saw them. Henry and Mrs. Fairmont stood outside the village posting in. They were partially hidden by the inn-yard stone wall, but still visible to anyone who cared to look. Mrs. Fairmont was dressed in half-mourning, wearing a gown of pale lavender that suggested more than it concealed. She had her hand on Henry's arm, her fingers tight on his sleeve, and she was speaking to him with obvious urgency. Henry was shaking his head violently, his face a mask of misery and rage. Whatever Mrs. Fairmont was saying, he clearly did not wish to hear it. But when he tried to step away, she gripped his arm harder. Her other hand came up to his chest, pressing against him with an intimacy that made Charlotte's stomach turn. She leaned close to whisper something that made Henry's shoulders sag in defeat. His whole body radiated despair. Charlotte's basket slipped from nerveless fingers. The jar of preserves inside shattered against the cobblestones with a sound like a gunshot. The noise drew Henry's attention. His eyes met hers across the narrow street, and the horror in his expression told her everything she needed to know. This was not over. Whatever had existed between Henry and this woman, it was not safely in the past. Mrs. Fairmont followed his gaze, and something like triumph flashed across her beautiful face. her lips curved in a smile that was all predator and all victory. She deliberately tightened her hold on Henry's arm as though staking her claim. Charlotte turned and fled. She did not care that she was running through the village like a madwoman. She did not care that people were staring and whispering. She made it to the woods beyond the last cottages before her composure shattered completely. She collapsed against an oak tree, the same oak where Henry had carved their initials when they were children. There she wept as though her heart was breaking. Because it was. She had been such a fool to hope and to believe that the merchant's daughter could ever compete with a sophisticated woman of the world. Mrs. Fairmont was everything Charlotte was not. She was beautiful, worldly, and confident in a way that Charlotte could never be. She knew how to hold a man's attention and how to bind him to her with invisible chains of desire and intimacy. Charlotte pressed her hand against the rough bark of the tree, finding the carved initials with her fingers. The carved letters, an H and an S, joined to a C and a B inside a lopsided heart, remained there. They had been 14 and 12 when Henry carved it, and she had treasured it ever since. It was proof that once upon a time he had cared enough to mark their friendship in something permanent. But childhood friendships meant nothing in the face of adult desires. Henry had tried to tell her there were complications and circumstances she did not understand. Perhaps Mrs. Fairmont was the complication. Perhaps Henry was trapped in a relationship he could not or would not end. Or perhaps, Charlotte thought with fresh pain, he simply enjoyed having both women available to him. He had the respectable merchant's daughter for his daytime hours and the sophisticated mistress for his nights. She did not know how long she remained there, but when she finally made her way home, her eyes were red and swollen. Her dress was stained with dirt and tree sap. Her mother took one look at her face and demanded the truth. Charlotte told her everything, the words tumbling out between sobs. "I saw them together, Mama," she said, "at the posting inn." She had her hands on him, and he looked so defeated and so trapped, but he did not push her away. And when she saw me watching, she smiled. She smiled as though she had won some contest I did not even know I was competing in. "The worst part," Charlotte continued, tears streaming down her face, "is that he told me his feelings were not in question. He made me believe, and he made me hope, and all the while she was here. She was his mistress, living under the same roof as his family. How could he do this to me, Mama? How could he make me love him again when he knew it was impossible?" Mrs. Bentley held her daughter close, her own face troubled. "There may be more to this situation than you understand, Charlotte. Lord Stratton did not strike me as a cruel young man, and the gentleman I saw at our home seemed genuinely taken with you. Men are often trapped in situations not of their making, particularly when matters of the heart are complicated by matters of honor or family obligation." "Then why did he not tell me about her?" Charlotte demanded, pulling back to look at her mother. "Why did he let me continue in ignorance while everyone else in the county was whispering about his London mistress? If he truly cared for me, he would have been honest from the start." Her mother had no answer for that, and Charlotte retreated to her room, claiming exhaustion. But sleep would not come. Instead, she lay in the darkness, remembering every moment she had spent with Henry over the past weeks. She recalled every conversation, every smile, and every touch of his hand on hers. Had any of it been real? Or had she been nothing more than a pleasant diversion, a way to pass the time while his real life and his real passions lay elsewhere? The next morning, a note arrived from Stratton Hall, delivered by a footman. Charlotte recognized Henry's hand immediately and nearly threw it into the fire unread. But curiosity, that treacherous emotion, made her break the seal. "Charlotte, I must speak with you," the note began. "Please, I beg you, meet me at the old oak by the stream at 3 o'clock this afternoon. There are circumstances you do not understand, and explanations I can give if you will only grant me the chance. Everything is not as it appears. What you saw yesterday was not what you think. I remain, now and always, your devoted servant, Henry. Charlotte crumpled the note in her fist. She would not go. She would not subject herself to more lies and pretty words that meant nothing. Henry Stratton had made his choice when he brought his mistress to Devonshire, and Charlotte would preserve what little remained of her dignity. At 3 o'clock, she sat in the drawing room with her embroidery. She was determinedly not watching the clock, and definitely not thinking about Henry waiting by the oak tree in the rain that had begun to fall. At 4 o'clock, guilt began to gnaw at her. What if there truly was an explanation? What if she was jumping to conclusions based on incomplete information? At 5 o'clock, she wondered if perhaps she should have gone, if only to hear his explanation and put the matter to rest properly. But it was too late now. Whatever Henry had wanted to tell her, the moment had passed, and perhaps it was better this way. Perhaps a clean break was kinder than prolonging the inevitable disappointment. What Charlotte did not know, and could not know, was the truth behind Henry's association with Mrs. Fairmont. It was not a love affair at all, but something far more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. The story began 2 years earlier, when Henry's younger brother, James Stratton, had fallen into profligate habits in Bath. James, always the wilder of the Earl's 2 sons, had accumulated significant gambling debts. Desperate and foolish, he had forged their late aunt's signature on a bank draft for £5,000 to settle his obligations. He had also funded an ill-advised elopement with a Bath actress named Miss Sophie Reed. Their aunt, Lady Constance Hartley, had discovered the forgery through her man of business. Rather than expose James and bring scandal upon the family, she had covered the debt with her own money. She intended to speak privately with James and help him reform. But the shock and distress had weakened her heart, which had never been strong. She had died suddenly 3 months later, taking the secret with her to the grave. The Earl and Henry had believed the matter buried with their aunt. Lady Constance had been discreet, telling no one of James's crime. They were wrong. Isabel Fairmont, through her extensive connections in the demi-monde where she had built her fortune and reputation, had learned of James's crime from Miss Reed herself. The actress, in her cups one night and boasting to her theatrical friends, had bragged about her wealthy beau's resourcefulness in securing funds for their future together. Someone had listened, someone who understood the value of such information, and word had eventually reached Isabel's ears. Isabel was always calculating and always looking for leverage in a world that gave women of her profession little security. She had seen an opportunity. She had approached Henry at a ball in London with devastating news. She possessed documents that proved the forgery. They were papers that Lady Constance had not destroyed before her death, and Isabel had acquired them through means she declined to specify. If Henry did not cooperate with her demands, Isabel would expose James. Forgery was a hanging offense. Even if James managed to escape the noose through his family's influence, the scandal would destroy them all. The Earl's position in the House of Lords would become untenable. Henry's own marriage prospects would evaporate, for no respectable family would ally themselves with forgers and criminals. His younger female cousins would find themselves unmarriageable, tainted by association. James himself would likely be transported to Australia at best, or hanged at worst. Isabel's terms were simple and devastating. Henry must maintain the appearance of their former intimacy, allowing society to believe he was still her devoted lover and protector. She wanted entree into the highest circles of the ton. She sought respectability by association with an earl's heir. She wanted to be received, acknowledged, and treated as though she were a genuine member of society, rather than what she was. She was a courtesan trading on her beauty and wiles. In return, and only in return for Henry's complete cooperation, she would keep James's secret. The documents would remain hidden. The family would be safe. Henry had spent 2 years trying to find a way out of the trap. He had offered Isabel money, substantial sums that would have set her up comfortably for life. She had refused. He had offered to purchase property for her, ensuring her security. She had laughed in his face. What she wanted was legitimacy. She wanted recognition and the power that came from being seen on the arm of one of society's most eligible bachelors. The meetings Charlotte had witnessed and the apparent intimacy between them were not romantic trysts, but tense negotiations. Henry was pleading for release and offering alternatives, desperately seeking some way to free himself without destroying his brother. Isabel was holding firm and enjoying her power. She occasionally tightened her grip just to watch him struggle. When Henry had returned to Devonshire, he had hoped that distance from London would end the arrangement. He had stopped appearing in public with Isabel. He had made it clear that their association was at an end. But Isabel had other plans. She had sensed, through her network of gossips and informants, that Henry's interest had been captured by someone else. She could not allow that. Her hold on Henry depended on his isolation and his belief that he had no choice but to comply with her demands. So she followed him to Devonshire. She inveigled an invitation from the Earl himself by presenting herself as a respectable widow with distant family connections to the Strattons. Once installed at Stratton Hall, she began her campaign to remind Henry exactly who held the power in their relationship. The meeting at the posting inn that Charlotte had witnessed had been Isabel's ultimatum. She threatened to expose everything unless Henry publicly resumed their association. She wanted him to escort her to the Harvest Home celebration and to dance with her. She wanted to make it clear to everyone in Devonshire that he was still under her spell, and she wanted him to end his friendship with Charlotte Bentley, whom she saw as a threat to her control. Henry had refused. For the first time in 2 years, he had looked Isabel in the eye and said no. He would not attend the celebration with her. He would not end his friendship with Charlotte. If Isabel wished to destroy his family, she would have to do so, but he would no longer be her puppet. It was this refusal that caused the desperate grip on his arm and the urgent whispering. Isabel had not expected resistance. She had grown comfortable in her power, and Henry's defiance had shaken her. She had been threatening and cajoling, trying every manipulation she knew to bring him back under control when Charlotte had appeared and witnessed the scene. But all secrets have a way of coming to light, and this one was revealed through the unlikely agency of Charlotte's practical mother. Mrs. Bentley, troubled by her daughter's unhappiness and unconvinced by the simple explanation of a love affair, decided to investigate. She had not built a successful marriage and helped her husband navigate the treacherous waters of trade and society by accepting surface appearances. Eleanor Bentley had learned long ago that the truth was usually more complicated than gossip suggested. She knew that understanding the full picture required asking the right questions of the right people. A few discreet inquiries among the Stratton Hall servants and a well-placed bribe to a talkative upstairs maid who was more loyal to coin than to her mistress brought the truth to light. The maid had overheard conversations between Isabel and Henry. She had seen the documents Isabel kept locked in her writing desk, and she had witnessed Henry's despair and Isabel's triumph. When Mrs. Bentley learned the full story, including the detail that James Stratton was currently hiding in the dower house on the estate, consumed with guilt over what his foolishness had cost his brother, she formulated a plan. It was bold and perhaps even risky, but Eleanor Bentley had not become the wife of a successful merchant by being timid. She found James in the garden of the dower house one morning. He was a young man of 21 who looked as though he had not slept properly in months. He was weeping openly, his face buried in his hands. He was the picture of genuine remorse. When he saw Mrs. Bentley approaching, he tried to compose himself, but it was too late. His shame and grief were written plainly on his face. "Mr. Stratton," Mrs. Bentley said gently, settling onto the bench beside him without invitation, "I believe it is time we discussed how to free your brother from the consequences of your mistakes." James looked up, startled and ashamed. His red-rimmed eyes were wide with surprise. "You know? How did you learn? Who told you?" "I know everything," Mrs. Bentley replied calmly. "I know of the forgery, the blackmail, and the hold that woman has over your brother. And I have a solution, if you are brave enough to undertake it and wise enough to see it through." Her plan was brilliant in its simplicity. It was the kind of elegant solution that came from years of navigating social waters far more treacherous than the aristocracy realized. James would confess the forgery publicly, but with a critical alteration to the narrative that would transform the crime from selfish dissolution to misguided loyalty. He would claim he had taken the money not for his own debts and pleasures, but to pay the medical expenses and repatriation costs of a fellow soldier. This friend had saved his life during the Peninsula campaigns. This friend was gravely wounded and had no family and no means. He had been languishing in a Spanish hospital with no hope of returning home. James was desperate to save his savior and was unable to raise the money through legitimate means. He had committed forgery in a moment of panic. It was still a crime, but it transformed the act from selfish vice into misguided heroism. Lady Constance's forgiveness and her covering of the debt would appear as Christian charity rather than family shame. The gambling debts and the actress could be quietly omitted from the narrative altogether. They would be written out of history as though they had never existed. More importantly, Mrs. Bentley's husband, through his extensive Liverpool connections in the shipping trade, could arrange a position for James with a trading company in New York. James could leave England quietly. His actress could follow if she truly loved him and was willing to build a new life in America. The scandal would fade into memory as just another young man seeking his fortune across the ocean. The beauty of the plan was that it required only a slight alteration of facts. James had indeed served briefly in the Peninsula, though he had seen no action and had quickly purchased his way out when the reality of military life proved less romantic than he had anticipated. Finding a fellow officer who had died in Spain and could serve as the fictional savior was simple enough. The dead told no tales, and regimental records were notoriously incomplete. James seized upon the plan with desperate gratitude. His hands shook as he grasped Mrs. Bentley's. "But why would you help me? After what I have done, and after the pain my actions have caused your daughter." "Because I believe in second chances," Mrs. Bentley replied. "And because your brother loves my daughter, and she loves him, and I will not see them destroyed by a mistake you made when you were little more than a boy. But make no mistake, Mr. Stratton. This is your one chance at redemption. If you squander it, or if you fall back into dissipation and vice, there will be no one to save you a second time." Within 3 days, the confession was made to the Earl. He was initially furious. His face was purpling with rage as he absorbed the news that his younger son was a forger and his heir had been suffering blackmail for 2 years. But gradually, as Mrs. Bentley's plan was explained, he saw the wisdom in it. The story would transform a family shame into a tale of youthful idealism gone awry. James could be sent away with some measure of dignity rather than in chains. And most importantly, Isabel Fairmont's leverage would evaporate like morning mist. Within a week, arrangements were finalized with impressive speed. The Earl's influence and Mrs. Bentley's connections worked in tandem. James and Miss Reed would marry quietly in a small ceremony attended only by immediate family. They would depart for New York within the month, carrying letters of introduction that would ensure James's success in his new life. The Earl would provide a modest settlement. It was enough to get them started, but not so much as to encourage continued dissolution. With the truth secured and James's future settled, Isabel Fairmont's carefully constructed world began to crumble. The documents she possessed were now useless. James had confessed publicly to a version of his crime that painted him as misguided rather than venal. There was no scandal left to threaten, and there was no leverage left to exploit. When Henry confronted her in the Stratton Library with the news that her blackmail had failed and that James was leaving the country with his head held high, Isabel made one last desperate play. She threatened to claim that Henry had promised marriage. She threatened to claim that he had ruined her reputation with false promises of making her Viscountess Stratton. Henry's response was glacial, and his voice was cold enough to freeze fire. "Any promises extracted through coercion and threats are void, Mrs. Fairmont. Our association, such as it was built on your manipulation and my desperation to protect my family. That foundation has now crumbled. As for your reputation, I think we both know it was ruined long before I ever made your acquaintance. If you attempt any further contact with me or my family, or if you so much as breathe a word of scandal, I will ensure that every door in society closes to you permanently. I have influential friends who would be very interested to learn how you came by certain documents in your possession and what you attempted to do with them. Blackmail, Mrs. Fairmont, is also a crime. Isabel stared at him. Perhaps she was seeing for the first time the steel beneath the polished aristocratic surface. She had mistaken his desperation for weakness and his willingness to protect his family for a lack of spine. She had been wrong. "You will regret this," she hissed, her beautiful face twisted with rage and fear. "I could ruin you with a word." "No," Henry replied calmly. "You could have ruined me. That power died the moment my brother stood before my father and told the truth. You have nothing left, Isabel. I suggest you take what dignity you have remaining and leave Devonshire. Today." Isabel Fairmont departed that afternoon. Her elegant coach left deep ruts in the drive, and her face was a mask of fury visible through the window. She would resurface later in Paris, sending exotic letters to former acquaintances in London. They were tales of continental adventures and wealthy admirers. Whether any of it was true or simply the fantasies of a woman who had gambled for the highest stakes and lost everything, no one could say. And no one particularly cared. But the damage to Henry and Charlotte's relationship seemed irreparable. She had not come to the oak tree when he had begged her to meet him. He had stood in the rain for 2 hours before finally accepting that she would not appear. He had not trusted her with the truth from the beginning. He had chosen instead to protect his family through suffering and silence, never considering that his silence was interpreted as betrayal. Months passed with no contact between them. A chasm of misunderstanding and hurt pride separated what might have been. Charlotte, in her pride and hurt, allowed Mr. Whitfield to believe his suit would eventually be successful. She did not accept his proposal, not formally, but she stopped refusing his visits. She stopped making excuses when he appeared at Bentley House with flowers and compliments. The vicar was kind and patient. He was willing to wait for her to set a wedding date while she struggled with the knowledge that she was settling for safety rather than love. Henry, learning of Charlotte's apparent acceptance of Mr. Whitfield through village gossip, felt something inside him die. He had finally freed himself from Isabel's chains. He had finally cleared the way for a future with Charlotte, only to discover he was too late. She had moved on. She had chosen safety over the complications he represented, and he could not blame her. He had given her every reason to doubt him. He had given her reason to believe the worst and to protect her heart by turning to a simpler and safer option. He threw himself into managing the estate with mechanical precision. He worked from dawn until well past dark, exhausting himself physically in the hope that his body's fatigue would quiet his mind's torment. But it did not help. Every path he rode reminded him of conversations with Charlotte. Every book in the library bore the memory of her opinions on its contents. Every room in Stratton Hall seemed haunted by the ghost of what might have been. The Earl, watching his heir slowly destroy himself with work and grief, finally took action. He sought out Mrs. Bentley, the woman who had saved his family from scandal. He asked her directly whether Charlotte truly intended to marry the vicar. "She has not accepted him," Mrs. Bentley replied carefully. "But neither has she refused him as definitively as she should. My daughter is hurt, your lordship. She saw your son with that woman and drew what seemed like the obvious conclusion. She does not know about the blackmail, about James, or about any of the circumstances that forced your son's silence. She only knows that the man she loves appeared to be entangled with a sophisticated mistress while paying court to her." "Then she must be told," the Earl said firmly. "This situation has gone on long enough. I will not watch my son waste away for want of speaking truth. With your permission, Mrs. Bentley, I would like to invite Miss Charlotte to Stratton Hall tomorrow afternoon. It is time for her to know everything." But fate had other plans. Autumn arrived, bringing with it the annual Harvest Home celebration at Stratton Hall. It was a tradition older than anyone could remember. It was the one night of the year when all the families of the district gathered, regardless of rank, to celebrate the completion of the harvest and give thanks for the year's bounty. The Earl opened the great barn for dancing, and long tables groaned under the weight of food prepared by the hall's kitchens. It was meant to be a night of unity and thanksgiving, but for Charlotte, facing the prospect of seeing Henry across the barn floor, it promised only pain. She attended because her parents insisted, and because refusal would cause talk. She wore a modest gown of brown wool that made her feel invisible among the other young ladies in their finery. Their bright silks and satins were like peacock feathers. Mr. Whitfield remained close to her side throughout the evening, his manner proprietary in a way that made her want to scream. He had begun to assume that her continued tolerance of his presence meant acceptance of his suit, and Charlotte had not had the heart, or perhaps the courage, to disabuse him of the notion. Henry moved through the crowd with mechanical politeness. He danced when required and conversed when necessary, but his eyes were dead. The vibrant and passionate man Charlotte had rediscovered weeks earlier had been replaced by a hollow shell. Charlotte watched him covertly, her heart aching at the change in him. She wondered if she had been wrong, and if there had been more to the situation with Mrs. Fairmont than she had understood. But pride and hurt kept her silent. If Henry had wanted to explain, he could have come to her and could have demanded she listen. Instead, he had sent one note and then given up. He had accepted her silence as rejection without fighting for her. What did that say about the depth of his feelings? The dancing began with a country dance, and Charlotte found herself facing Mr. Whitfield. He was an adequate dancer, careful and correct. Dancing with him felt like dancing with a particularly earnest pupil at a deportment class. There was no joy in it and no spark, just a dutiful execution of steps learned by rote. When the pattern of the dance briefly separated them, Charlotte found herself momentarily alone on the floor. She watched the other couples swirl past in a kaleidoscope of color and motion. Then the music shifted, calling for a change of partners in the traditional manner of country dances. She looked up to find Henry standing before her. Their hands met in the pattern of the dance, and even through their gloves, Charlotte felt the shock of contact like lightning striking dry timber. For a moment, neither of them moved. They simply stood there, hands clasped, staring at each other while the music swirled around them. The other dancers moved past. Some were staring, and some were pretending not to notice. "Charlotte," Henry said hoarsely. His voice was raw with emotion. I must, we need." He could not seem to form a coherent sentence. His blue eyes were blazing with an intensity that made Charlotte's breath catch. Her heart was hammering so hard she was certain everyone in the barn must hear it. Instead of finishing his thought, his hand tightened on hers with almost painful force. With a complete disregard for protocol, propriety, or the consequences, he pulled her from the dance floor. Gasps and whispers erupted around them like a flock of startled birds taking flight. Mrs. Ashby's shocked cry of outrage was audible over the music. Mr. Whitfield started forward as though to intervene, but the Earl, who had been watching from the sidelines, placed a hand on the vicar's arm and shook his head. Whatever was about to happen, it needed to happen, without interference. Henry dragged Charlotte through the crowd and out the barn's back door into the walled garden beyond. He did not stop until they were hidden from view of the barn's windows by the high stone walls covered in ivy. The sounds of music and laughter from inside seemed distant and muffled. They belonged to another world entirely. "Henry, what are you doing?" Charlotte demanded, trying to free her hand and failing. His grip was too strong and too desperate. "People will talk. Mr. Whitfield will be furious. And your father—" "Let them talk," Henry interrupted fiercely. He finally released her hand only to grasp both her shoulders instead. "Let them all talk until their tongues fall out and their voices fail. I cannot bear this another moment, Charlotte. I cannot watch you accept that tepid man's suit while everything I need to tell you goes unspoken. I was too proud, too foolish, and too concerned with protecting everyone but the one person who mattered most. They had stopped in the center of the garden, beneath an ancient apple tree heavy with fruit. The air was thick with the scent of ripe apples and the last roses of autumn. The moon was rising, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. Charlotte could see tears on Henry's face, glinting in the moonlight. "I need to tell you everything," he said, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "I must tell you about Isabel, about James, and about why I could not speak freely when you most needed the truth from me. I have been a coward, Charlotte, choosing my family's honor over your happiness. I protected my brother's secret at the cost of your trust. I can only beg your forgiveness and pray to God it is not too late. I pray that you have not given your heart irrevocably to another because I was too weak to fight for it when I had the chance." The story poured out of him in a torrent of words. He told her everything he should have said weeks ago. He spoke of the forgery, the blackmail, and the months of silent suffering. He detailed Isabel's threats and manipulations, James's guilt, and the impending departure for America. He described his time in London, the gambling, drinking, and women that had left him feeling hollow and ashamed. He explained how returning to Devonshire and finding her again had made him want to be worthy of the girl who had loved him unconditionally when they were children. He described the agony of the past months. He spoke of loving her, but being unable to act, forbidden by Isabel's threats from speaking honestly. He recounted watching helplessly as society's cruelty drove a wedge between them. He confessed to standing in the rain for 2 hours at the oak tree, hoping she would come, and dying a little more with each passing minute that she did not appear. "I have carried this with me every day since I failed to meet you at that tree," Henry said, pulling a small velvet box from his coat pocket with shaking hands. Inside was a ring. It was a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, clearly old and valuable and beautiful. "It was my mother's. I took it from her jewelry box the day I wrote to you, intending to ask you to marry me. I intended to beg you to wait until I could free myself from Isabel's threats. But you did not come, and I thought that you no longer cared. I believed that you had finally realized I was not worth your time or your tears. I thought that the merchant's daughter had wisely chosen to protect her heart from the worthless heir who had nothing to offer but complications and scandal." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, and her vision blurred as she looked at the ring, at Henry's face, and at the raw vulnerability in his expression. "You fool," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You absolute fool. I did not come because I thought you had chosen her. I saw you together at the inn and believed myself unworthy of competing with a woman like that." Every cruel word Mrs. Ashby and the others had spoken seemed confirmed by what I witnessed. "I have loved you since I was 8 years old, Henry. I have loved you through 7 years of silence and through every moment of doubt and pain. I have loved you through watching you not recognize me. But I thought that you could never see me as anything more than the merchant's daughter who presumed too much." "That I did not see you?" Henry's voice cracked with emotion. "Charlotte, you are everything. You are the only person who has ever truly seen me. Not the heir or the title or the fortune, but me. You see the real me beneath all the trappings of rank and privilege. I would give up all of it to have you as my wife. I would give up every acre of land, every pound of income, and every expectation society has of me. But I have no right to ask, not after how I have failed you. And not when you have pledged yourself to a man who can offer you safety and respect without all the complications that come with me." He moved to kneel, but his movement was hesitant, a reckless disregard for his station that highlighted his emotional turmoil. He stood in the mud of the garden, heedless of his fine evening clothes, still holding the ring box with his face upturned to hers in the moonlight. "But I am asking anyway. I am begging, actually, with no pride left and no dignity to preserve." Charlotte Bentley, will you marry me? Not someday when circumstances are more convenient, and not when society is ready to accept us. I am asking now. I am asking for an immediate and irrevocable commitment before God and society and anyone who cares to pass judgment on the Earl's heir who dared to love. A voice cut through the night like a knife before Charlotte could answer, freezing them both in place. Below his station, actually, though I appreciate the sentiment. They both turned as one to find the Earl of Stratton standing at the garden entrance. His tall figure was silhouetted against the light spilling from the barn. He had clearly followed them and heard everything. He had heard every word of confession and declaration. Charlotte felt her heart plummet. The brief flame of hope was extinguished by the cold water of reality. This was it. The Earl would forbid the match. He would send her away in disgrace and remind her of her place. She and Henry would be torn apart by the same forces of class and privilege that had kept them apart for months. But the Earl was not looking at her with anger or disdain. His expression was complicated. It was a mixture of regret and understanding, and something that might have been approval or perhaps admiration. He walked slowly across the garden to where his son stood, his dignified pace at odds with the drama of the moment. To Charlotte's utter astonishment, the Earl offered Henry his hand and helped him stand firm. Then, in a gesture that would be talked about in Devonshire for years to come, the Earl turned to Charlotte. He executed a slight but unmistakable bow. It was the kind of bow one gave to an equal, not to a social inferior. "Miss Bentley," he said with formal courtesy that somehow conveyed warmth. "I have been a fool of the highest order. Pride and concern for propriety, for what people would say, and for maintaining the family's position blinded me to what has been obvious to everyone else for months. My son has been dying by degrees this summer. He was fading before my eyes, and I refused to see why. I told myself it was the business with James, or the strain of estate management, or any number of convenient lies I constructed to avoid facing an uncomfortable truth. But it was you. It has always been you." He paused, and his stern features softened in a way Charlotte had never seen. "My own marriage was considered scandalous in its day. My late wife's father had been in trade before he purchased his baronetcy. He made his fortune in shipping, much like your own father, Miss Bentley. Society whispered for years that I had married beneath me, or that the Earl of Stratton had lowered himself for money or beauty or some other base reason. They could not understand that I married her because she made me laugh, because she challenged me, and because she saw past the title to the man beneath." The Earl's voice grew thick with emotion. Grief for the wife he had lost remained fresh despite the passage of years. She had a spine of steel and the good sense that comes from understanding the value of money earned rather than merely inherited. She could manage an estate better than my steward. She could balance accounts that baffled me, and she had the courage to tell me when I was being an arrogant man, which was regrettably often. The ton whispered, but we were happy. We were happier than most arranged matches between blue-blooded families who care more for lineage than love. The Earl looked directly at Charlotte. His eyes searched her face. "I see those same qualities in you, Miss Bentley. My son has chosen wisely. He has chosen not merely for beauty or accomplishments, though you possess both in abundance, but for strength of character. That is what will serve a future countess well, and that is what this family needs. This family needs someone who understands that privilege is a responsibility and not just a pleasure. It needs someone who will not be cowed by society's judgment or bend to its petty cruelties. You give your blessing?" Henry's voice was barely above a whisper. His hand found Charlotte's and gripped it as though she might disappear if he let go. "I give my blessing," the Earl confirmed, and there was no hesitation in his voice and no reservation. "Though I suggest a wedding by special license within the week, and a honeymoon in Scotland far from prying eyes and wagging tongues. Let society adjust to the notion before you return. They will talk regardless, as gossip is the ton's favorite sport, but at least you will be legally bound before the most virulent critics can attempt to separate you or poison your happiness with their venom." Charlotte found her voice at last, though it shook with emotion. "My lord, I do not know what to say. I never imagined and I never dared to hope." "Say yes to my son," the Earl replied, and this time there was definitely a smile lurking at the corners of his mouth. "He has made a complete mess of asking, standing in mud with a ring that has not even been cleaned properly in 30 years. But his heart is genuine. Say yes, Miss Bentley, and make this old man very happy by giving him the daughter he wishes he had raised. God knows my own boys have given me enough gray hairs to last 3 lifetimes." Charlotte looked at Henry. He was watching her with such hope and fear and love that her remaining reservations crumbled to dust. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger and more certain with each word. "Yes, I will marry you, Henry Stratton. I will marry you within the week, by special license, in scandal and joy and complete disregard for what anyone thinks of the merchant's daughter who dared to become a viscountess. And heaven help anyone who tries to stop us." Henry pulled her into his arms. Propriety be damned. He kissed her there in the garden, while his father politely turned away to examine an apparently fascinating apple tree. It was not Charlotte's first kiss, but it was the first that mattered. It was the first that promised forever, rather than just a moment stolen from time. Henry kissed her as though she were air, and he a drowning man. He kissed her as though he could pour 7 years of longing and weeks of misery into this one perfect moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Charlotte was laughing and crying at once. Her carefully arranged hair was coming loose, and her modest brown dress was stained with mud from pressing against Henry's ruined evening clothes. She had never been happier in her entire life. They returned to the barn, walking hand in hand. The Earl escorted them with an air of quiet satisfaction, and the reaction when they entered was immediate and varied. Mrs. Ashby looked as though she might faint from the scandal of it all. One hand was pressed to her ample bosom, and her features twisted in a mask of affronted dignity. The younger ladies whispered behind their fans. Some were envious, and some were delighted by the drama. The gentlemen looked amused or disapproving depending on their temperaments. Mr. Whitfield, to his enormous credit, approached them with dignity intact. He offered his congratulations with what appeared to be genuine grace. "I always knew your heart was elsewhere, Miss Bentley," he said quietly. "I hoped time might change that, but I can see now that some loves are too deep to be dismissed or forgotten. I wish you every happiness, truly." Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes at his kindness. "Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. You are a good man, and you deserve someone who can give you their whole heart. I am sorry I could not be that person." "As am I," he replied with a sad smile. "But it is better to discover it now than to build a marriage on half measures and comfortable lies. Lord Stratton is a fortunate man. I hope he knows it." "I do," Henry said, extending his hand to the vicar. "And I promise you, I will spend every day of my life proving myself worthy of her trust." Charlotte's parents arrived, having witnessed the entire scene from across the barn. Her father looked somewhere between proud and anxious, and her mother was beaming with undisguised satisfaction. Mrs. Bentley had known, Charlotte realized. Her mother had known about the blackmail, about James, and probably about everything. She had been working behind the scenes to ensure this outcome. It explained so much about her mother's calm assurances and her insistence that there was more to the situation than Charlotte realized. "Mama, did you?" Charlotte started, but her mother interrupted her. "Later, dearest," Mrs. Bentley replied, pulling her daughter into a warm embrace. "For now, simply be happy. There will be time enough for explanations and gratitude." The next 6 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation that left Charlotte's head spinning. The Earl procured the special license, calling in favors from a bishop who owed him several political debts. Charlotte's mother helped her select a gown of ivory silk from her existing wardrobe. It was simple but elegant when trimmed with antique lace that had been Mrs. Bentley's own grandmother's. Henry's aunt sent an heirloom veil that had been worn by Stratton brides for 3 generations. It was a delicate thing of Brussels lace, so fine it seemed made of spider webs and moonlight. James sent a letter from Portsmouth where he and Mrs. James Stratton were waiting for their ship to New York. His words were humble and grateful. He thanked Charlotte for her mother's intervention and promised to build a life in America that would honor the second chance he had been given. Mrs. James Stratton, the daughter of a bankrupt curate who had turned to the stage out of necessity, added a postscript in surprisingly elegant handwriting. She welcomed Charlotte to the family and expressed hope that they might correspond, as she was grateful to have a sister-in-law who seemed to value character over circumstance. They were married in the private chapel at Stratton Hall on a gray October morning. The sky seemed determined to remain dreary until the very moment Charlotte walked down the aisle on her father's arm. Then, as though the heavens themselves approved of the match, the clouds parted. Golden sunlight streamed through the chapel's ancient stained-glass windows, painting the stone floor in jeweled colors. Henry waited for her at the altar, looking more at peace than she had ever seen him. His blue eyes were bright with unshed tears as he watched her approach. When he took her hand, Charlotte felt the rightness of it settle over her like a blessing. It felt like destiny finally fulfilled after years of waiting and pain. The wedding breakfast was a small affair, with just close family and a few trusted friends. It was warm and joyful in a way that grand society weddings rarely achieved. The Earl gave a speech that had everyone laughing and crying by turns. Charlotte's father, a man uncomfortable with sentiment, managed to express his pride in his daughter and his confidence in his new son-in-law without breaking down completely. Then Charlotte and Henry departed for Scotland in the Earl's traveling coach. They waved to the assembled well-wishers as they drove away toward their future. As the coach rattled down the drive, Charlotte leaned against Henry's shoulder. She was exhausted and exhilarated, and she felt his arm come around her, solid and secure. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Charlotte replied honestly. "Though I confess I am still somewhat amazed that this is real. I am amazed that I am actually your wife and that we overcame everything that stood in our way." "Not we," Henry corrected gently. "You. Your courage, your willingness to risk your heart despite every reason to protect it, your mother's brilliance, and your father's connections were responsible. I contributed mostly cowardice and complications. You are the hero of this story, Charlotte. Never doubt that." The honeymoon in Scotland was everything Charlotte had not known to dream of. They stayed in a small castle overlooking a loch. The water was silver in the autumn light, and mountains rose in the distance like ancient guardians. They walked the moors by day, and Henry taught her to fly a hawk the way his grandfather had taught him. Charlotte read poetry aloud by the fire while rain drummed against the windows. By night, they learned each other's bodies and souls with equal intensity. Henry was by turns passionate and tender. He was always attentive to her pleasure and always making her feel cherished and desired. They talked for hours, making up for lost time. They shared secrets and fears and hopes for their future together. "Do you regret it?" Henry asked one night as they lay tangled together beneath thick quilts. The fire was burning low in the grate. "Do you regret marrying me and accepting the scandal and the gossip that will follow us?" "Not for a single moment," Charlotte replied honestly, tracing patterns on his bare chest with her fingers. "Though I confess I am nervous about our return to Devonshire. Society will not be kind, at least not at first. I heard what Mrs. Ashby said as we left the barn. She called me a woman who had trapped you with feminine wiles." "Society can go hang," Henry said firmly, pulling her closer. "Let them whisper and speculate and invent whatever scandalous narrative pleases them. We know the truth of what we have, and that is all that matters. Besides, you will win them over eventually. You won my father's approval, which I thought impossible. The rest of the ton will be simple by comparison." They returned to Devonshire ces semanas later. Their faces were glowing with happiness and Scottish air. They found that Henry had been both right and wrong in his predictions. Society did whisper, extensively and creatively. They invented elaborate stories about how Charlotte had ensnared the Earl's heir. But the Earl's public support of the marriage and his obvious affection for his new daughter-in-law won over even the most reluctant gossips. Mrs. Ashby remained pointedly disapproving. She cut Charlotte in the street on more than one occasion, but her influence waned as others accepted the new Viscountess Stratton. Charlotte threw herself into learning the duties of her position. She managed the household with an efficiency that impressed even the most critical servants. She supported various charitable endeavors in the district, using her merchant family's connections to improve conditions in the local textile mills. Her intelligence and dedication slowly earned respect even from those who had initially dismissed her. 2 years after their wedding, Charlotte did something that scandalized society anew. She cemented her reputation as someone who would not be confined by conventional expectations. She published a treatise on textile economics. She published it anonymously as being by a lady first, though the local circle soon knew it was her work. She argued for reforms in working conditions and wages that would benefit both workers and manufacturers. Henry defended her absolutely. He stood in drawing rooms and at dinner parties to declare that his wife had one of the finest minds he had ever encountered. He said that he would be a fool to silence her simply because society preferred women to be ornamental rather than useful. "If you disagree," he told one arrogant man who had the temerity to criticize, "that says far more about your own limitations than hers." At one particularly memorable dinner, Mrs. Ashby made a final attempt to assert her former dominance. She approached Charlotte with barbed comments about the duties and proper behavior of aristocratic wives. Charlotte listened politely, her face serene, until the older woman ran out of steam. "How fascinating, Mrs. Ashby," Charlotte said with a sweet smile that did not reach her eyes. "Though I confess I prefer not to socialize with people who confuse ambition with dignity. I also prefer not to socialize with those who measure a person's worth by the circumstance of their birth rather than the content of their character. I do hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Please excuse me." It was revenge served cold and with perfect politeness. Henry kissed her hand across the table while Mrs. Ashby sputtered in outraged impotence. After that night, Mrs. Ashby's invitations became increasingly scarce. Her opinions were increasingly dismissed as the ton slowly turned away from her brand of petty cruelty. 3 months after the dinner party incident, Charlotte discovered she was with child. Henry was beside himself with joy and anxiety. He was always fussing over her until she laughingly told him she was not made of porcelain and would not shatter if he stopped hovering. The Earl was equally delighted. He was already planning the celebrations that would mark the arrival of his first grandchild. On a warm summer afternoon, seeding Macy's into her pregnancy, Charlotte sat in the library at Stratton Hall. She sat in the same library where she and Henry had spent so many afternoons as children. She was rereading the diary she had kept as a girl. She smiled at her younger self's earnest declarations and melodramatic fears. There on a page yellowed with age were the words she had nearly forgotten. "I love Henry Stratton. I think I will always love him, even when I am old and gray. I hope one day he will love me too, not as a friend or a playmate, but as a husband loves his wife. I will wait for him forever if I must." Henry found her there. Tears were streaming down her face as she laughed at the earnest certainty of childhood love that had somehow, miraculously proven true. "What is so amusing?" he asked, settling beside her carefully. One hand rested protectively on her rounded belly where their son grew. "I was just remembering," Charlotte said, showing him the page with its careful script and determined hope. This little girl who loved a boy who seemed impossibly far above her station. She would never have believed that one day she would be his wife, carrying his child and living in the house where they played together as children. She spent years doubting, and she spent years afraid that her love was foolish and hopeless. And yet, here we are. "Do you still love him?" Henry asked softly, reading the childish words with a smile. "Do you still love that boy she wrote about with such certainty?" "More than ever," Charlotte replied, wiping her tears. "Because now I love the man he became as well. I love the man who was brave enough to stand in the garden and ask a merchant's daughter to be his viscountess. I love the man who sees me for who I am and values what he sees. He taught me that sometimes the love we think is impossible is simply waiting for the right moment and the right circumstance for both hearts to be ready." Henry kissed her gently. His hand remained splayed across her belly. "The man who would be nothing without you. I was lost and hollow until you reminded me what it meant to be seen and known and loved completely." Their son was born 3 months later on a crisp October morning. He arrived with strong lungs and a full head of golden hair that made Henry laugh with delight. They named him Thomas Charles Stratton, after Charlotte's father and Henry's late grandfather. The Earl wept openly when he held his grandson for the first time. He abandoned all pretense of aristocratic reserve in the face of such joy. The christening was attended by everyone of note in the county. It included a heavily pregnant Sophie Stratton, who had returned from New York for the occasion with James. Her husband looked healthier and happier than he had in years. He had paid back every penny of the forged amount to the estate. He had earned the money through his own labor in the shipping trade, and the Earl had publicly forgiven him. As Charlotte stood in the chapel, holding her son while Henry stood beside her, she thought about the improbable path that had brought her here. She thought of the years of waiting and hoping. She recalled the pain of loving someone who seemed forever out of reach. She remembered the heartbreak of misunderstanding, and finally the joy of finding each other despite all obstacles. She glanced up at Henry. He was watching their son with such tenderness that it made her heart ache with happiness. When he looked down and smiled at her, she knew with absolute certainty that every moment of pain had been worth it. The merchant's daughter and the Earl's heir, the girl from the library and the boy who carved their initials in a tree, were together at last. After the ceremony, as guests milled about offering congratulations, Charlotte caught sight of a letter someone was reading. The name Isabel Fairmont leapt out at her. Apparently, the woman had attempted to establish herself in Parisian society as the widow of some fictitious French nobleman, but had been exposed as a fraud. Charlotte felt no satisfaction in the woman's downfall and no triumph at her enemy's defeat. She felt only relief that Isabel could no longer threaten anyone. The last guest to approach them was Mrs. Ashby. She had aged considerably in the past 2 years. She looked at Charlotte for a long moment, and her expression betrayed a grudging resignation to the inevitable. "You have done well for yourself, Viscountess," she said stiffly. "Better than I would have predicted. Perhaps better than you deserved." "Yes," Charlotte agreed simply, refusing to be drawn into old battles. I have done well because I chose to believe I was worthy of love rather than accepting the limits others tried to place on me. It is a lesson I intend to teach my son. Worth is not measured by birth, Mrs. Ashby. It is measured by character, by courage, and by the willingness to fight for what matters most. Mrs. Ashby opened her mouth as if to argue, then seemed to think better of it. She nodded once and moved away. Her power was finally broken. Charlotte watched her go with a quiet certainty that she had been right to hold fast to her love. That evening, after all the guests had departed and their son was sleeping peacefully in the nursery, Charlotte and Henry stood on the terrace of Stratton Hall. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The air smelled of autumn and wood smoke and possibility. "Do you remember," Charlotte said, leaning into Henry's embrace, "when you carved our initials in the oak tree by the stream? You told me that one day, when we were old and married to other people, we would bring our children there. You were so certain our lives would follow conventional paths." "I remember," Henry said, his arms tightening around her. "I was 13 years old and certain that I knew exactly how my life would unfold. I thought I would marry someone appropriate, produce heirs, and manage the estate. Then I went away and lost sight of what mattered most. But somehow, miraculously, you waited for me. Not just waited, but grew into the woman who could stand beside me as an equal. Not just waited, Charlotte corrected gently. I grew and I learned. I became someone who understood her own worth. We both had to change and to suffer before we could find our way to each other. Perhaps that is the real gift. It is the journey that taught us how to deserve the happy ending. Henry turned her to face him, his hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. Tomorrow, let us ride to that oak tree with our son. I want to show him where his father carved a promise into bark. I never imagined that 30 years later it would come true in such a perfect way. They kissed as the sun set. In the village below and in drawing rooms across the county, people would continue to talk about their unconventional marriage. Some would say Charlotte had been ambitious, and others that she had been impossibly lucky. Let them talk. Charlotte Bentley Stratton, Viscountess Stratton, knew the truth. She had loved a boy who became a man who learned to see her as Charlotte, unique and irreplaceable. He had loved her because of everything she was, strong, wise, and unafraid to reach for what she wanted. The best revenge, she had learned, was not in words designed to wound. The best revenge was living well and loving deeply. As she stood on that terrace with her husband's arms around her, Charlotte knew she had achieved something far better than revenge. She had achieved genuine happiness. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If this story of love that conquers social barriers and prejudice touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of resilience, courage, and enduring hope.